Well, hey guys, welcome back to Blackboard Biology. In this video, we're going to jump back into some of our ecology stuff, and specifically, we're going to be looking at this idea of ecosystems. Now, often this will be the level, as we discussed in the last video, the quote-unquote house, the level of organization within which we're going to really study a lot of ecology concepts. So let's dive in. So the first thing I want to kind of do is give us a definition of an ecosystem and to give us a visual, because that's always helpful. So here we have kind of this wetlands, this estuary, kind of where the fresh water meets the saltwater ocean, this ecosystem here. And so we're going to see lots of different things. And within this ecosystem, there's going to be lots of different species, lots of different populations, lots of different abiotic or non-living physical things in this environment. And so an ecosystem is a biological community. So the community, again, is all the populations. So I see these right here. I see these birds. I see these birds, right? All these different species of fish and these turtles, all this stuff. These are all different populations living in the same place, in the same environment at the same time. So they make up a biological community. And so it's the community, so all the living things and the physical environment surrounding it. That is what distinguishes the ecosystem from simply just the biological community, is that the ecosystem includes the non-living physical environment surrounding it. So when we study an ecosystem, we have to study things like the water, the atmosphere, the climate. So the overall weather patterns over many, many years, we have to study that climate as part of the ecosystem, because that's going to affect the interactions of organisms. For example, this area, plenty of water, plenty of rain. But if we were to go to the savanna, in like these grasslands in parts of Africa, there's a dry season and a rainy season. And the behavior and the interactions of animals during the dry season and the rainy season are drastically different. You will find both predator and prey coming to the same watering hole at the very beginning of the rainy season when there actually is water, right? When they're all incredibly thirsty and they've not had enough water for quite a while, they'll put aside the predator-prey relationship and just come to drink the water. But once there's been enough water and they're kind of back to normal, it's back on and they're going to hunt. So we have to study the physical environment surrounding the community when we study an ecosystem. Now, I want to talk a little bit in this video about the interactions and the behaviors that we see within an ecosystem. So to do that, we kind of have to talk about some of the main players that are here in the ecosystem and how we can categorize them. One way that we kind of categorize the organisms in an ecosystem is by what we call trophic levels. And a trophic level has to do with energy. How do they get their energy? How is energy passed on from them to another group? So the first trophic level, the one on the very bottom, the foundation of everything, are the autotrophs. Okay, so let's break this word down a little bit, because that's really a fancy sounding word there, right? Trophs, again, trophic, right, points us back to trophic energy levels. Auto, meaning self. So, for example, an automobile is self-mobilizing. It moves itself. Well, these are self-energizing. So what would autotrophs be? Well, those are another word for them that we use. They're the producers in an ecosystem. The producers. That's a terrible D. I may erase that. They are the producers. And so what we're talking about, that's these guys, the plants. That's these things, anything, even aquatic plants. It would be, now we can't see it because it's not really shown that much in the picture, but that would be all the little algae and things that grow in the water. Anything that produces its own quote-unquote food. That would be a producer or an autotroph. Okay, so these words right here, producer and autotroph, mean the same thing. Okay, so producers are autotrophs. Now, so those are the bedrock, the foundation of any ecosystem, the foundation of any food chain or food web. And that is because the majority of them, in the typical case, are going to be photosynthesizers. They're going to use sunlight to produce their own food. And so that is how energy is first going to make its way into this system in a usable form, is when they capture solar energy and convert it into stored chemical energy that then is usable within the system. So anything that produces its own food, whether through photosynthesis or chemosynthesis or some other process, but typically it's going to be photosynthesis, they are autotrophs or producers. So that is the first kind of trophic level. So we would call them producers, okay? And so I'm going to kind of build us a little something over here starting out. So we would have producers on the bottom. Okay, now the other group, well, what's the opposite of making your own food? Well, it's eating, right? So you eat food from something else. Well, those would be called consumers. Now, another term, the fancier term that uses the word trophic and the word troph in there would be, consumers would be heterotrophs. Now, you've probably heard the prefix hetero in other contexts, and it means different. So different energy, not self-energizing. They can't use photosynthesis. They actually have to consume things, take things in, digest for nutrients and such. So consumers and heterotrophs means the same thing. All right? Now, this picture is full of heterotrophs, lots and lots and lots of them. So I look here, I see these birds, lots of different birds. Those would be heterotrophs. These fish, these turtles, even these guys down here would appear to be some kind of shrimp or krill. They eat things. Even if it's organisms, there's even types of plankton that eat other types of plankton, and so that would make them heterotrophs. Okay, so at the bedrock of the ecosystem are the producers, and on top of that you have successive levels of consumers that eat the producers, and then in turn there would be other consumers up here above that would eat the other consumers. So we kind of needed a hierarchy here of consumers. So let me clear some space and we'll dive into that. So within these trophic levels that we're discussing here, we're going to have a hierarchy, and it's best represented as a pyramid, and we'll see why in just a moment. And so let me get going here. We have producers at the very bottom, and then we have these modifying terms that help us figure out which producers we're talking about. So if I'm talking about consumers, that eat the producers, we would call them primary consumers, because they eat the plants, they eat the photosynthesizing organisms. They are primary, first level consumers. Above that, we would have secondary consumers, because they're the second level consumers who eat the primary consumers. And so producers get eaten by primary consumers. Now, we're always drawing arrows in the direction of energy transfer. The producers are not eating these. The producers are giving energy to the primary consumers, who then can give energy to the secondary consumers because they get eaten. Then we would have, after primary and secondary, we would have what's called tertiary. Now that has to do with this prefix over here, tertiary, right? Kind of tetra. You've heard of the game Tetris. All the blocks are made up of 4 pieces. The prefix tetra has to do with the 4th level. And if you count these levels, tertiary is our 4th level that we're putting in here. So tertiary consumers. These may be the top level consumer, the top apex predator in their ecosystem, depending on, what is there. All right. And so what happens is that as you do this, as you kind of draw these things out, and I'm going to have to kind of color code here. Maybe I can, no, it's not going to let me resize. That's fine. I can kind of color code these the way that we did here. And so I'm going to draw a pyramid. And the reason for that is the amount of energy in each level is going to decrease as we go up. And so we start out with our producers down here, and then we move up to primary consumers, and then I forget which color I used, I believe it was purple. Then we have secondary consumers, and then at the top we have tertiary consumers. And what happens is each time that something gets eaten and it goes up a level, we lose a great deal of energy. In fact, I can tell you exactly how much. We lose 90% of the energy when we go from one level to the next. So of all the energy down here that is trapped, is stored chemical energy in the producer level, only 10% will be passed on and actually stored in the primary consumer level. So all those, in a more of a local ecosystem, like where I live, all those deer that are eating grass and acorns and all those things, they're only going to store and have available for use 10% of the energy that they get from eating all those things. Same here. If something comes along and is able to get a hold of one of those deer and eat it, it's only going to get 10% of the energy that was available at the primary level. Same thing here. Whatever comes along and eats that, it's only going to be able to get 10% of the available energy at that level and store it and be able to use it for use. And so this is known as the 10% rule. When energy passes from one trophic level to the next, only 10% gets stored and is usable at the next level. And you may ask, well, where does it go? Well, 90% of it is lost through other chemical processes, through digestion, through excretion of wastes, through the generation of heat. Some of that energy is converted into thermal energy and is just lost to the surroundings. So 90% is lost, only 10%, so that's the 10% rule, of the energy passes on to the next trophic level. Okay, so if we were to do some quick calculations here, we would see that if we assumed that the producers held 100% of the initial, let's say initial, they have 100% of the initial energy in this ecosystem, only 10% would get passed on here. Now I'm going to do some quick figuring here of the initial energy. So 100% is down here with the producers. That's the initial energy in the system. 10% of the initial is passed to the primaries. Well, what is 10% of 10%? Well, that would be 1%. So only 1% of the total original energy in the system makes it to the secondary level. And what would be 10% of 1%? Well, it would be 0.1%. So only 0.1% of the total original energy made it all the way up to the highest trophic level here. So you can see why a pyramid is the best representation for this. All right, and this comes into play a lot. You're going to find that not just in terms of energy levels, but also in terms of biomass, how much like actual material is there in the living organisms in an ecosystem. It's often represented with kind of these like step pyramids where you have, you know, your producer level down here would have the most biomass, followed by primary, followed by secondary, and finally you have the tertiary consumers at the top who have the least amount of biomass represented in the entire ecosystem, which makes sense if you think about it. If I look into a typical ecosystem, tons and tons and tons and tons of plants, tons of producers, they're all over the place, you know, depending on where I'm at. There's a pretty good population of herbivores, right? Things that eat plants. So these are the primary consumers. This might be deer or whatever. There's a even smaller population of the predators that eat these, the secondary ones. But if you think about it, the most rare ones are that top level. So there's not just a ton of bears running around everywhere, or there's not just a ton of mountain lions running around in their environment. There are fewer of them. So there is less biomass, less material at that energy level than the others. So this will be a biomass pyramid. And of course, when we look at an ecosystem, we don't always just want to look at these as a pyramid. Often we want to look at them in terms of a food web or a food chain. So what we could start with might be, let's say in this ecosystem, we're going to start with algae or maybe some like phytoplankton. Those would be a variety of plankton that, photosynthesize like photons, light particles. They're photosynthesizing plankton. They would get eaten by maybe these krill or shrimp or whatever these are down here. We'll say shrimp or something. Well, those shrimp would be the primary consumers. Well, those shrimp are going to get eaten by something else. They're going to get eaten by some kind of fish, who in turn would get eaten by a larger fish, who then in turn would maybe get eaten by a shark or something. And so we've created a food chain where we show the interactions. These arrows always show the interactions between these organisms. The arrow goes in the direction of energy. So what this arrow right here means is that these shrimp are eating the phytoplankton. Okay, so the arrow always goes in the direction of energy transfer. It always points toward what is doing the eating. Now, often it's not just good enough to represent all of these things with a food chain, because that's not always the best representation of an ecosystem. Often we want to look at it as a food web, which we'll do with this illustration and we'll wrap up the video. So here we have a web. So perhaps these guys right here get eaten by these fish, who in turn might get eaten by these fish, who in turn might get eaten by these larger fish, who in turn might get eaten by what appears to be a shark here. This turtle is eating, well, I drew that actually the wrong direction. This jellyfish here is being eaten by this turtle. Right? So this kind of looks like a parrotfish maybe, and if so, it might eat some of these coral here. Again, and it in turn might be eaten by the larger fish or by the shark. And as we do this, I may need to switch colors. That blue doesn't show up that well. As we begin kind of constructing this, we're going to see it gets rather complicated and is not in a linear fashion like a chain is. It is a web of things. And so these birds are eating, this bird definitely looks like it's eating, some of these shrimp and things. These birds, I'm not sure exactly what they're eating, but it's probably these little tiny fish. There are going to be, organisms out there that are going to feed on some of these grasses and things. These trees might, now these birds right here are not going to eat these trees. That's just an example. Those trees will be eaten by something. And so it becomes this web. But again, the arrows work the same way. It always shows the direction of energy transfer from the organism being eaten, passing to the organism doing the eating. And so this, I hope, has been a good introduction to the study of ecosystems and kind of explain some things and some of those relationships for you. And as always, I want to thank you for tuning in and watching Blackboard Biology. And I always want to encourage you, feel free to subscribe to my channel, leave comments on the videos, and I'll see you next time on Blackboard Biology.